what I'm going to be presenting is the overarching view of what we've put together, a culmination of 3 pieces of research. And I just start with this little cartoon sketch because I think it really does this has been out well before the term of digital disruption. You might have seen this, it's been around for about 20 years. And really there's so much happening, that the speed of what's happening, and it's fantastic the Honourable Minister was presenting what's happening in Tasmania. There seems to be a lot of agility here in Tasmania to rise to the challenge, but we do need to be able to take stock, and hopefully this conference and other events provides us that opportunity to skill up and understand what's happening in this space so we can really not lose our wheels. And so the aim of the inquiry was to examine disruptive technologies and new technologies, because there's a fine line there between what is new technology and what is disruptive, and investigate their potential for reshaping housing markets and reconfiguring housing policy. And so the inquiry consisted of 3 projects that we've undertaken over the last 18 months. And so the first project really was a road mapping project that was led by myself, working with colleagues at RMIT and at Swinburne University, so very much a collaborative effort. And that particular project, understanding the disruptive technology ecosystem in Australia in the context of urban housing and creating, as I said before, a roadmap. So that's available on the AHURI website. The second project, Technical Disruption in Private Housing Markets, the case of Airbnb. Dr. Laura Cromlin from City Futures has been leading this project, and she'll be presenting more about Airbnb and the outcomes of that project shortly afterwards. And the third project, Matching Markets in Housing and Housing Assistance, Dr. Andrea Sharaman, who is also here presenting her work and will be participating in the discussions during the day. So those are the 3 glossies that we have available freely from the AHURI website, and it's fantastic in the spirit of open data and information that AHURI does make all these reports very accessible and open. So just very briefly, our methodology that we've undertaken. We're not going to go into the depths and bowels of our methodology, but just to give you a high-level synopsis, we did look at a local review and international literature review, so looking at that scan of what's available in the published literature as well as the grey literature. And unsurprisingly, there isn't that much in the peer-reviewed published literature on disruption and technology. There's a few papers emerging on Airbnb and its impact, but they've really only been around for the last 2 or 3 years, which is surprising, really, when Airbnb's only been around for around that period of time. So it is quite new, this area of the gig economy and digital disruption. We've run a series of workshops with policymakers and practitioners, and some of these workshops were co-design workshops, and I'll come back to the concept of co-design. Have people been involved in co-design workshops, co-production? A couple of hands, raise your hands. Okay, probably half the room, so that's good. And a mapping of Airbnb, both a spatial mapping and a network mapping of key stakeholders, and Laura's going to talk more about that. And the survey of Airbnb hosts. So it looks like we've got 2 slides here. Very rigorous methodology. Okay, so disruption as a term, Clay Christensen from Harvard, you might have seen this definition of disruption, talks about disruption as innovations that disrupt, redefine performance trajectories, and consistently cause the failure of industry's leading players. So the original guise of disruption wasn't overly positive for those who were in power. It was about bringing them to their knees and new players coming on board and disrupting the ecosystem. And so Today, the terminology disruption, there's the upside of disruption. There was a EY report a couple of years ago looking at the upside of disruption, and I think it's becoming more mainstream. Disruption isn't as disruptive as it once might have been. It's now in our nomenclature. We're talking about it. We have a conference on it, and so forth. So what we're now looking at is how we can, look at the understanding the technologies and possibly be ahead of the game to respond to those technologies with regulations, practices and training, and understand how we might restructure accordingly. So in the disruptive space, we have something that you might have heard of, another sort of buzz is smart cities. And smart cities, and I will talk about this a little bit because I think it is quite significant for us when we're looking at disruption. The Turnbull government, it was under the Turnbull government. We had the Smart Cities Plan come out in 2016, so not that long ago. And really, that's our only sort of citywide national plan, and it is called a Smart Cities Plan. It does pick up, as I'm sure you know, housing affordability, concepts of the 30-minute city and so forth. So it does pick up sort of more mainstream sort of planning vernacular. But it really is under the auspices, for better or for worse, of smart cities. And so some would argue we live thanks to IBM, who I guess coined the phrase a decade or so ago, smarter cities. We are in a sort of era of smart cities. We have our plan. And we also have what Cisco values by 2025, an industry worth $3.3 trillion. So there's a lot in that. There's apps, there's urban tech, there's a lot in there, but it's forecast to grow from in the hundreds of billions to the trillions in the not too distant future. Packed into that is a series of Internet of Things sensors, where by about 2025 we're expected to have over 30 billion sensors on the planet. So that's our fridge talking to us, that's air quality monitoring sensors in this room, outside. And so we, like it or not, we're packed with an array of sensors and technology and data. And so this disruption that we're experiencing now is forecast to actually exacerbate. So understanding how we respond to the positives and the challenges is something we'll just keep coming back to during the day. So there we go, billions of sensors and trillions of dollars. And it's, I guess, one of the sort of key components of smart cities and digital disruption, as the Minister was talking about, with the gig economy or the shared economy. Sharing might be too nice a word to give it in certain instances. So we are seeing assets, so-called lazy assets, being reappropriated and used. And so in some instances, we would argue that that makes sense. In other instances, we're looking at perverse outcomes. I'm not going to talk in detail about Airbnb because Laura's going to look at that. So we've got the casualisation of workforces. And so what does that mean? And we're seeing with Deliveroo, and we're seeing Uber and Airtasker and Airbnb, we're seeing working rights and conditions eroded into, and because these technologies are quite disruptive, government typically is on the back foot in being able to then develop the right regulatory environment to provide suitable conditions for people working in these environments. But on the flip side, there's an opportunity. I've caught Ubers before, and you speak to someone who happens to be a mortgage broker working in Bondi, and they're just happening to pick up a couple of extra hours before work or after work to pay the rent, as you would living in Bondi. So these sharing platforms and tools are not that new. We've had notice boards where you could look for flatmates. At the university, we still have our old-fashioned notice boards where you can search for a flatmate to share a room. But we're seeing these digital platforms And Andrew's going to talk more about matching markets, being able to really seamlessly connect people. And underpinning that really is this wealth of data. And we've also seen the rise of the gig economy driven through globalization. So the fact that these platforms are ubiquitous and in many countries around the world, except I guess in some instances where you're trying to access Google services in China, they're quite ubiquitous. And so that's opened up huge market opportunities for these companies. You've seen these bike sharing companies. Anyone hop on a bike share this morning to get here? Anyone at all? No one. There must be a few companies here in Hobart, in Tasmania. We've got this new one that's just arrived in Sydney called Lime, and they've literally just dropped 2,000 bikes, these electric bikes, and they're part of this urban tech, this disruptive wave of mobility as a service. And we'll see how they go, because you might have been looking at the papers across Australia. You've seen some of these bikes, like mobikes, finding their way into the Yarra River, on top of the exhibition building. I don't know how some of these bikes get up there, but I think it's a challenge for certain individuals to get them there. But they don't seem to be going away. We seem to have this continual wave of disruption and the gig economy. But also what we have emerging is the machine economy. So we're looking at artificial intelligence. So you've got your Uber drivers now, but then you've got Uber running trials in Arizona and places around the world where really we don't need a driver. So there's no more gig in that economy. It's really just all machine. So and those elements of the gig economy, whether it's Airbnb or Uber or the Lime bikes, they offer opportunities, but also they're continually challenging the regulatory environment. I mean, if we're looking at bike share or even car share, GoGet in Sydney alone, in new housing developments out Campbelltown, is reducing car dependency by 40%. So there is an opportunity here to rethink about how we look at housing developments, housing estates and so forth. And I guess that would be one sort of connection point, is how do we start to not just look at the technology, but look at our city as a systems and think about disruption and how we might disrupt how we operate across systems. I mean, this is obviously a housing conference, and it was very pleasing to hear the Minister talk about the connection with housing and planning, but the elephant in the room, for me, is still around that connection to transport and other services, health services, and how do we do that better? Okay, so we have this fantastic infographic that we put together to sort of summarise how we've sort of distilled our view of the world of disruptive technologies and the disruptive landscape. So this is in the report that was released today. I'm not sure if you can read that very well in the back there. I'm not going to go through all of it, but I will touch upon the main points in the next few slides. So we're going to be looking at big data, and what does that mean? There's the rise of mapping tools and their actual implementation. So we've got Google Maps on our phone, but there's a whole array of more advanced map analytical packages that we can look at. There's blockchain, so the promises of blockchain and Bitcoin and cyber currencies and all the encryptions and smart contracts. What does that mean for the housing sector? And matching market platforms. So with big data, there's Professor Mike Batty at University College London. Some of you might know his work looking at complexity of cities. He had a pretty simple definition of big data. It's basically a data set you can't open in an Excel spreadsheet. And there's about 1 million rows in an Excel spreadsheet, so you can open quite substantial data sets. But for example, that data on the right there, that's some data that we've been playing around with Transport for New South Wales, the tap-on, tap-off data, the smart card data, which exists for most cities around Australia. So if you want to try and get a cut of that data from your transport agency and start to look at the 30-minute city construct and how people are moving from their place of residencies to place of employment or so forth, then you need to be able to program in a language like R or Python to be able to grab and manipulate this data. So new skills are required as we move into working with big data. And so Excel and Word just don't cut it with big data anymore. And we got the rise of dashboards, being able to then create these visual analytics and platforms so we can start to interrogate what's happening with big data. So we've got the 5 V's of big data. So it started off with 3 V's, but now we've even gone to 5 V's. So volume, so it's a large data set. Varieties, so there's an array of different data sets coming. Velocity, so if we could handle this, that, for example, that Opal card data, that took a good month of someone's time to be able to process just to create that image. So if we wanted real-time, up-to-date, minute-by-minute analysis of big data, we need technologies and high-performance computing to do this. And the costs go up exponentially. So even just understanding this landscape, what does it mean to work with big data, and what sort of resources do you need? So I think when we're looking at disruptive technologies, whether it's big data or other tools, we need to really examine what's the cost and the value and do that cost-benefit analysis. And then, of course, that comes down to the value, and then there's the veracity of the data. So once we have this big data, we can do all sorts of magical things. We can look at extracting patterns. It could be patterns of use in a housing development. It could be patterns of use across a whole city at a macro level. So depending on how fine-scale that data is, we can run certain analyses on it. But then you've also got big data where you've got a lot of the social media data that I'm sure we're aware of, the Cambridge Analytica usage of Facebook data and those sorts of things. So there's all sorts of challenges being faced by big data. So we've looked at that in quite a lot of depth in the report. So these are just a few touchstones of some of the high-level findings. Mapping tools. So we've got our near map tools. We've got our Google Earth tools and Google Map tools. There's a whole array of GIS tools. A number of you who work in government or in consultancies will have a GIS team, and that team might sit next to your planning team, and they might play nicely or they might not play nicely. And I just highlight that because I think a lot of these opportunities are breaking down silos between organisations as well as across organisations. And there's a wealth of geospatial data out there that's been valued globally in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And then there's an array of digital planning tools to assist urban planning and policy making. But how many of these tools are actually used for strategic planning? I think we're at the cusp of using these tools. Like there's a number of tools that we reviewed. There's tools like the Envision tool, the Envision Scenario Planning tool, coming out of the work of Professor Peter Newton and Professor Peter Newman over a number of years that AHURI has sponsored. And we've got tools that are now able to be used to plan sustainable housing precincts, to run economic feasibility models against those scenarios. This particular tool, there's a workshop in Blacktown with Blacktown City Council to look at sustainable precinct developments around greening the grave fields across Sydney. And coming back to the work of Peter Newton, there's a lot of work and still is work in Melbourne and in Perth and parts of Australia where we're looking at our grave fields and how we really start to unlock some of those potentials for multiple benefits. But some of these tools, like What If and Raise and Envision, are not on everyone's desktop. There's still an opportunity for these tools to move beyond academia, beyond the research sector, and actually use and adopted more rigorously to support more transparent participatory planning and engagement and better housing forecasting. So these tools are out there. There's a level of maturity in some of those. I know there's the Australian Urban Research Infrastructure Network, AURIN. I think colleagues like Ian Butterworth will have been intimately involved with. And that toolkit, how many of you are aware of AURIN or are using AURIN? Put your hands up if you're using AURIN. So Auran has about 4,000 data sets across all the cities across the country and is freely available to anyone in government, in any research organisation, non-for-profit. And so even just being aware of some of these tools, there's a lot happening in the data space. And I think having these tools understood and more rigorously used is still an educational process, and knowledge transfer and translation needs to occur. So it's a bit of a whirlwind tour of mapping tools. Blockchain. So blockchain really came out of these sort of this world called Cybertown many years ago. If you've heard of Second Life, where you actually had currency being exchanged and you needed some encryption. This is before sort of Bitcoin really took off. So if I wanted to create a virtual house, and I actually had students about 15 years ago building 3D houses in virtual worlds, and being able to then understand how you might then exchange those houses. And Bitcoin was the currency back then. And now it's sort of taken off, and there's what we know as blockchain, which is really these little packets of information which can be attributed to an individual, to a house, to a person, and you have these blocks of information that chain together through encryption technology. And so there's a lot of interest in the law fraternity and others to look at how do we have smart contracts. So with this encryption, pretty much impenetrable until we get quantum computing, we've got blockchain offers this opportunity of these distributed ledgers. And there's companies being set up to harness this power, looking at, I think, microgrids, and Power Ledger is one that just recently was listed. Gemma Green in Perth has set up Power Ledger, and really if you're starting to look at distributed approaches, microgrids for energy and so forth, looking at blockchain has huge potential. And it's really supported again through these online platforms. Without being fully embraced by the internet and connectivity, we wouldn't have blockchain, which I guess has a nice link into the matching markets as well. So, matching markets. I'm not going to talk much more about matching markets either, because we've got Laura and Andrea talking about matching markets. The context of Airbnb is obviously a matching market. And really, we're seeking agents to be paired with someone or something. So it could be a good or a service. It could be, I want to find that new bike. I need to be matched to that bike so I can pick it up and cycle from the University of New South Wales, hopefully safely, along dedicated cycle paths all the way into the city and drop that off. Or it could be accessing some accommodation. And so the digital platforms provide that opportunity for more efficient matching of services. So we've gone into quite a lot of depth in those reports along those technologies. I guess that was sort of quite a high-level précis of some of the opportunities in that disruptive technology space. I guess if you delve down into, say, some of the mapping tools, and you start to look at what's happening with the data analytics, there's also that array of artificial intelligence applications that are really facing us now, and there's a huge opportunity with AI. I mean, even since we've written this report and this landscape is changing so quickly, I was just in Korea with the Korean Land Housing Authority a month or so ago, and they brought together some people from Helsinki and from Singapore, and we're talking about digital twins. And I'm not sure you've really heard much about digital twins, but really it's the coming together of 3D data sets, so you can have a 3D representation of a house or a precinct with artificial intelligence. And so you'd be able to interact with that housing estate and ask it questions, and it would have some embedded intelligence. If some water pipes broke, it would let the building manager know that those water pipes have broken, and would propose different solutions to fix those problems quite quickly and efficiently. So I guess it's the coming together of sensors, IoT, with 3D representations of models at a very fine scale, with sort of predictive analytics and artificial intelligence. So that is actually here now, and in Korea they're planning their next land and housing development based on a digital twin. In Singapore, Virtual Singapore is embracing the digital twin. They have a very detailed 3D model of Singapore, and they want to be able to bring in very fine-scale models and simulations so they can understand the impact of wind on putting up new high-rise developments and what's the impact of wind tunnels and those sorts of things. In Helsinki, they already have a 3D model of every building and every house. And they make that completely open to everyone in the public. And anyone here in this room could log on to 3D Helsinki, and you could click on any of the 18,000 buildings or houses in Helsinki, and you could find out the age of that building. You could find out what material it was made out of. You could download it and create your own 3D virtual Helsinki. So a lot of this technology is moving quite rapidly. And so how do we stay abreast of it is a key challenge. Okay, so some of the key findings from our report has identified 4 main fields of technological advancement that are disrupting the housing sector. So the matching markets, we've got the big data, GS mapping software and its full utilisation, and blockchain. So key finding 2, technological change presents real opportunities for housing across the sector. So more efficient allocation of housing stock through matching markets, there's potential there. More accurate and transparent property management systems, like in that scenario I mentioned before. Better informed planning and development processes. So if we have a better pipeline of open data and big data, we can understand what's happening and we might be able to deal with some of those regulatory blockages. Key finding 3, technological change presents new challenges for the housing sector. Responding and regulating disruptive technologies. Protecting the privacy of clients and individuals. Now this is a big one, we're going to talk more about this, and I guess the Cambridge Analytica example with social media is a prime example of some of the issues and challenges as we start to move to fine-scale data and this tension between big data sets, aggregate data sets, and fine-scale individual information. Ensuring transparency of complex technological systems, and this is one of the challenges with AI and big data. We start to run these algorithms and we run neural network analyses and that sort of thing. The transparency and being able to understand what the computer has said. If the computer says the meaning of housing is 42, how do we actually understand what that means? Because if you run some of these AI approaches, you can't work that out. The cost and access risks associated with the commercialisation of technology systems. We'll talk more about this too, because I guess in this neoliberal environment where we're outsourcing so much, there's opportunities and challenges there. And understanding spillover effects, disruption in one part of the housing market like Airbnb, and what does that mean for other parts of the sector? So finding 4, we really need more agile and critical policy responses, short-term responses, to be able to pilot things and being able to look at this wave of disruption is just happening so quickly. There was a couple of weeks' notice before those Lime bikes arrived in Sydney. So what's the process for the City of Sydney, Greater Sydney, to respond to that, and for Melbourne? And I think they've got scooters arriving in Brisbane next week. Strategies for implementing long-term cultural change and system upgrades. So this is all around the technology. We need a culture, a data culture, a technology-friendly culture. And looking at this playbook, and I've got some slides here, but I'm going to just leave them with you. We came up with sort of 10 principles, and they're in the final report of how government, non-for-profits, and the private sector might look at a playbook for responding to digital disruption. Okay, so I'm flicking through this, looking at scans, risk assessment. I mentioned before co-design and co-production, so bringing various minds and sectors together to come up with solutions. Performance-based approaches. Looking at privacy and consumer protection, it's got to be foremost. Continuous education and workforce training. Organisational culture to open data sets and looking at innovation in technology. Learn from other sectors, learn from transport, from health, biotech, other sectors that are out there. Look at managing long-term risks and understanding the data asset as an infrastructure. And really a joined-up approach, a system of systems approach, and how do we work across government sectors as well as across industry, government, academia and non-for-profits and the community. So my very last slide, I think. We are in the era of smart cities, and technology and its disruption impacts are here, so we need to deal with them. We need governance to do this. There's upsides and downsides to this disruption, and we need to have a balanced view when we're looking at disruption. We need to be well educated around disruption. And so if we don't understand what open data is, or big data, or dark data, how do we deal with it? And as I mentioned before, we have that playbook, and I've really gone quickly through some of those high-level recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. We have time for just one or two quick questions in a moment, but before we do, we'll start with the first audience poll for the day. So that's your cue to pull out your smartphone or your tablet with the AHURI app, hopefully already installed on it, or perhaps to quickly install the AHURI conference app, and go to the live polling section. So to do that, simply open the conference app to today's conference, select live polling, and then this is an interactive session, and it'll take you to our first question. And the first question is, how do you feel about digital disruption of the housing market? Is it fear and loathing? Is it excitement and opportunity? Or is it confusion and anxiety? Let's start the polling. Please submit your answers and hit the arrow to make sure it gets tallied. Start the clock. Yeah. Right, there's not a lot of Hunter S. Thompson. The fear and loathing is low. That's good. A lot of excitement and opportunity. That's a terrific response. Bit of confusion, bit of anxiety, but hopefully we'll address that with what we hear for the rest of the day. Look, we have time for one or two quick questions from the audience. There's one straight away down the front here. We'll get a microphone to you in just a moment. No, please do. For the audio recording.
Thank you. So Shari McPhail from Community Housing Limited in Victoria. Thank you very much for your presentation, and I'm excited about the opportunities that it holds. However, when we talk about matching properties and things like that, I start to think about the tenants that we're housing and the people that we're working with. Some of them don't even have mobile phones yet. So that's just my concern. And I just wanted to say that if we can interact with the digital space as much as we want, and we can really embrace it, but for a lot of the people that we're working with, they simply can't access that. And so I'm not sure how we're going to marry those two together.
It's a good question and comment. I guess with the digital technologies, we're seeing, for example, if I go to Indonesia and parts of Jakarta, a lot of people there, and even the poorest of the poor, have 2 or 3 mobile phones. And so there is the ability, I guess, for low-cost technology. So I think that there's considerations of the provision of technology for those who might not be able to afford it. There's also then the ability to have a mixed analog digital process, and we still have our libraries and community centres, and so being able to engage those who might not be quite across having that technology. And I guess it's not even just having the technology. I guess with an ageing population too, we have that technology divide of an ageing generation not being that comfortable. I know my dad still struggles to do much with his phone apart from make a phone call and a text message. And so I think, there's a number of issues that we need to look at with knowledge transfer and translation.
That's a good point. We have time for perhaps one more question from the floor. Yes, straight down the middle.
Tony Wellington again from Noosa. I just need to be clear, when you refer to your research and you talk of Airbnb, is this a catch-all phrase that also includes stays, home away, etc., or is your research specific to Airbnb and ignoring the other platforms? And will that hold true for the rest of today?
I guess there's been a deeper dive into Airbnb, but we have picked up those other platforms that you've mentioned, and they're considered. I guess one of the challenges in actually having a deeper dive into some of this is actually getting the data. And I guess, and Laura will talk about it further, but getting some of the Airbnb data through various means has been easier than getting data from other sources. But no, the research has looked broader than Airbnb.
Thank you, Chris. I think there are probably a number of other questions we'd like to explore in this time, but time is getting away from us. And I'd encourage people to come and talk to Chris during the breaks. We'll dig deeper into some of the research that he gave an overview of in that session throughout the rest of the day. So thank you, Chris.